All right, so we've spoken now about the economy, we've spoken about the politics of how the Spanish controlled Latin America, and now we're going to talk about how socially the Spanish controlled Latin America. So we're still talking about how did Europe control Latin America, but now we are going to, like I said, talk about the society, and in particular, what was called the Society de las Castas. So let me just scroll. So how did the Society of the Castas, or the Society de las Castas, help the Spanish to control Latin America? Now, if you remember, and I hope you all do from last year, in Ms. Canon's class, the Spanish created a very rigid social structure in their Latin American colonies, and they used that as a means and method to control the people. So that whole system, you probably remember from last year, you have the peninsulares at the top, and the peninsulares are those who were born in either Spain or Brazil. That's why it's called the peninsulares, because they're from the Iberian Peninsula. And then you have your Creoles, which are your Spanish born in the Americas. Then you have the mestizos, and the mestizos are mixed, usually mixed between Spanish and Native Americans. You have mulattoes, who are mixed African. They could be mixed with Native Americans. They can be mixed with a mestizo. They can be mixed with a Creole. And then you have your African slaves at the bottom. So this was the pyramid of how everything was pretty much created here. Now, with the conquest, when originally the Spanish started conquering the area, we see that the Native American women were very sexually exploited. And that happens, unfortunately, a lot of times throughout history across the world. When places are conquered, usually the women are kind of brutalized and raped and taken advantage of. But we also see that in attempts to form alliances with the Spanish, alliances were formed by giving the Spanish either Native American concubines. A concubine is kind of like a mistress, and also by providing them with female servants. Amongst the upper classes, we also see marriage between the Spanish with indigenous women of the nobility. And so that also occurred. There was very few European women that came over originally when these areas were first being conquered. So as a result, there were commonly marriages between the Spanish and the Native Americans. And so as a result, we start to see the growth of a population of mixed background, and those people were beginning to be called mestizos. Now, interestingly enough, the Spanish originally did not know what the heck to do with the mestizos. Originally, they were kind of locked away and hidden away because they thought they were kind of almost like shameful. They didn't know how to handle this. But as we start to see this becomes more of a regularized thing, the Spanish have to find a way to deal with it. So if we look at this picture here, we see a painting of a mestizo family. And here we start to see the whole hierarchy of the different groups in what later becomes known as the Society de las Castas. Basically, a person of mixed blood, they had a higher status than the Native Americans, but they were not fully accepted as equals to the Spanish, but they lived life as a Spanish person. They lived according to the rules of Spanish society. In Brazil, we have a much larger slave population because Brazil was primarily a sugar colony. So African slaves were brought over in large numbers, and those women, those female slaves were very much exploited by their owners, and they were taken as mistresses. And sometimes the owner would free their children of that union, and sometimes they would keep their children enslaved, which is a lovely parent. Thanks, Dad. Appreciate that. So the Sociedad de las Castas, which was based on racial origins, kind of created this chart, which is what I have here, of what happens if you are half mestizo, half Native American, half Spanish. But what happens if then a mestizo marries a Spanish? What is that child? And there was different terms and words used and labels put on depending on if you were a quarter Native American or an eighth Native American or a half Native American or 75% Native American, because after a while the combinations become endless. Apparently it got to the point that eventually a person who was mestizo, give it enough generations, that person could come back to being Spanish, or the family could come back to being Spanish again. It was a very complex system that was set up. Eventually the system was kind of ditched because it was just too complex. But the mixed people of origin of mixed origin were called castas, and they were shopkeepers, they were small farmers. In 1650, the mixed people were about 5 to 10% of the population. By 1740, they were 35 to 40% of the population. In Brazil, the free people of color were 28% of the population, and that was equal to the white population in Brazil, because the slaves in Brazil outnumbered the white population. So as this mixed population grew, many of them had restrictions placed upon them, so their social mobility, to try to stop their social mobility, but they realized they really couldn't. But basically, your physical characteristics were criteria of your wealth and status. So the lighter skinned you were, the fairer you were, the closer you would be considered to European, and that mattered a great deal in the colonies, because if you were European or white, you had a great social advantage, because most of the Creoles, who would be the Europeans, they were wealthy merchants, they were the landowners, they were the bureaucrats, they were the mine owners, and they had all of the economic power within the society, even though they didn't have any of the political power, because the political power was reserved for the Peninsulares. Now, originally, all whites had privileged status. So if you were a Creole, if you were a Peninsular, you had privileged status. Over time, these distinctions began to develop between the Peninsulares and the Creoles, because the Spanish government didn't trust the Creoles. They felt that the Creoles would be loyal to the Americas, also might be loyal to the mestizos. Also, who knows, God forbid, they might actually have a Native American ancestor back mixed in their family tree, and the Spanish did not want that in the government. But the Creoles, dominated the local economies. They had a very strong sense of self-identity, and they were very sensitive to any suggestion of inferiority that was placed upon them by the Peninsulares, who had all the political power. Now, the father of the family had legal authority over his children until the age of 25, and women had a subordinate position in these countries, or in these colonies. They could not serve in government. The women were assumed to be mothers and take care of the home. Once a woman got married, she was under the authority of her husband. If she was widowed, she would then be able to assume some sort of direction over her family. However, the low-class women, in a lot of ways, had a lot of economic power. They would control the small-scale commerce in the town, so they might be like the shopkeepers or the entrepreneurs. They worked in fields and they worked in factories. Now, marriages were arranged, and the woman's family was expected to pay a dowry, but that dowry remained the property of women. They did have the right of inheritance, which is actually more than women had in a lot of other places. However, upper-class women who did not marry, that was a very big no-no, and most times they were placed in convents. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is how did reforms made in the 18th century strengthen the economic control over the colonies? So I've got to give you a little bit of European history background here. By the 18th century, the Spanish colonial system was very much outmoded. The Spanish were involved in a ton of wars. They were having a huge debt. Their population itself was declining. There was a lot of internal revolt within their country itself. And because the British and the French and the Dutch were beginning to move into Latin America, and they were beginning to lose territory. That system I talked about in the last video about how the Spanish had that convoy system and they kept such tight control over their shipments coming in and out of the colonies was beginning to kind of fall apart. The annual fleets were becoming irregular. The silver supply was starting to drop, so the silver payments were beginning to decline. And a lot of goods that were being shipped out of the Americas were not being shipped on Spanish ships. Also, like I had said in the last video, most of the colonies were self-sufficient, so they didn't need anything from Spain in order to survive. So the central governments were becoming weaker, and the local aristocrats in the colonies were increasing control over the colonies. Now, in 1702 to 1713, the Spanish are going to fight a war called the War of the Spanish Succession. This is going to be a war with the French. Basically, the Spanish king by this point, the Spanish royal family likes to marry their own members of their family, I guess you could say. Well, most of the crown heads of Europe like to marry their own members of their family. They like to keep their bloodline fresh, or their bloodline pure, I guess I should say. And so by this time period, the King of Spain, Charles II, was very much an example of too much inbreeding. Supposedly, like, his jaw was really long and he couldn't close it, and he was constantly drooling, and he had these small beady eyes, and he was physically unable to father children. So this was creating a problem, because who then was going to succeed him as the king of Spain? Now, his sisters, and he was from a second marriage, but his sisters from his father's first marriage were married to King Louis XIV of France and was married to the Emperor of Austria. Both of those women had children and grandchildren, and both of those kings, the King of France, Louis XIV, and the Emperor of Austria, Ferdinand, I believe his name was, wanted their grandsons to be the next King of Spain, which led to the War of the Spanish Succession, because a lot of people in Europe were worried that if the French won, then France would have control of Spain and France, and it would create this huge upset in the balance of power. Now, as a result of the War of the Spanish Succession, the French actually won. However, in the peace agreements, Spain and France could never be united. But still, it was the French royal family, which was the House of Bourbon. It was the French royal family that now becomes the ruling family of Spain as well. So as a result, we start to see a lot of reforms begin to be made in the colonies, because the system had become outmoded, and you now have new rulers coming in, and they're going to make a bunch of changes. So first off, French merchants were allowed to trade in Seville, and the English were allowed to trade Spain. The English gained control of the slave trade in Spanish America, and the French were allowed to trade. The other thing that we see is Charles III, who is King of Spain from 1759 to 1788, decides he's going to make the government more efficient and more powerful. So he reforms the colonies. So this is where we see these new viceroyalties created. If you remember when I showed you the map on the last slide, I had said eventually when the population grows, we're going to see new viceroyalties added to New Spain and Peru, being New Granada. I'll write that down for you. And that's going to be in 1739. And then also Rio de la Plata, which is going to be 1778. And they did this to try to provide better administration. Royal investigators were also sent to the colonies to kind of oversee what was going on. This guy in particular, his name was Jose de Galvez. And so Jose de Galvez spent 6 years in Mexico. He went back to Spain and became the Minister of the Indies. And he was the chief architect of the reform that's going to be carried out there. So they realized that a lot of those local magistrates were abusing the system, and there was lots of bribery and corruption going on. And over time, even though originally the Creoles were not allowed into systems of government, the Creoles had found ways to get themselves into systems of government, into the upper levels of government. So Galvez comes in, he eliminates the Creoles from the upper bureaucracy. And new offices were created. So the local magistrates were gotten rid of, and they were replaced with something called intendants, which were essentially governors. This was a system that was borrowed from the French. They improved the tax collection, and they made the governments more effective. But what this did is it disrupted the pattern of influence and the power of the Creoles, and it got the Creoles really angry. The Spanish are also going to ally with the French in the 7 Years' War because it's the same ruling family. As a result, the Spanish are going to lose Florida and Havana as a result of the 7 Years' War. And Spanish troops are going to be sent into New Spain. Now, the thing that really is kind of quite funny here, you just took all the Creoles out of their positions of power in the government and made them very angry because of it. And in return, they needed the Creoles to hold the positions of military rank. So they were taken out of political power, but instead they were made in charge of the armies. So now you've just angered them politically, taken away some of their rights, but now you've just given them guns and armies. Not going to work out well in the end. What we do see, though, is that the government is going to take a more active role in the economy. The state is going to take over the tobacco and gunpowder industries and create monopolies over them. And as a result, commerce is going to expand. Cuba is going to become a slave colony that's going to be focusing on the production of sugar, coffee, and tobacco. Buenos Aires, which is the capital today of Argentina. That's how you spell Buenos Aires. Population is going to grow, and it's going to become a huge center of the ranching economy. However, we do see that the local economies weren't able to compete with European imports that were flooding into the Americas. And with the French, with all these reforms that were being made, control was tightened over international trade, and the Spanish economy became a lot less diverse. The mining expanded, and in the end, this kind of revived the Spanish Empire for the short term. But in the long term, like I said before with the militia, you removed the Creoles from government, but you gave them the control of the military, which just created a larger sense of dissatisfaction amongst the elite with now the means to fight back against the Spanish, because now they're heads of the military. Not the brightest move in the world. So my last question for this topic of how Spanish controlled Latin America is, how did the people react to these reforms? So in the mid-18th century, there was a growth in the population. And by the end of the century, the Spanish-American population was 13 million. So for instance, in Mexico, between 1740 and 1800, the population went from 3.5 million to 6 million. Although half of that population was still Native American, because even though we know most of the Native Americans died out, Mexico, Peru were the centers of Native American population, so there's still going to be large numbers of them. We are starting to see declining mortality rates, increasing fertility levels, and increasing immigration and slave trade. So after 1700, we're going to start to see some serious rebellions begin to break out. One of the first ones was called the... Sorry, I thought I turned the pen on. One of the first ones is going to be called the Comunero Revolt. And that's going to be in 1781. This is in New Granada or Colombia. And this was against the government control of the tobacco and liquor consumption. It was also against rising new taxes that were being in place. The rebel army almost managed to take control of the whole colony. Then in Peru, this man here, he was a mestizo, mixed Incan and Spanish. His name was Tupac. How do I spell Tupac? Hold on. You probably... Tupac Amaru. So he claimed descent from the Incas, and he started a massive rebellion against the bad government in Peru. So for 3 years, this revolt went on. The viceroyalty was completely in turmoil. There was 70,000 Indians and mestizos who were rebelling against the colonial regime. Eventually, Tupac Amaru was captured and executed, but the rebellion continued on in his name. Ultimately, it failed. But this was a significant rebellion because it scared the heck out of the Creoles, because the Creoles feared social upheaval and feared the Native Americans and the mestizos managing to rise up and take over this country, their country. So that's something that's going to come back later when we start talking about the Native Latin American movements for independence and why the Creoles treat the Native Americans the way that they do, and we'll see that later. When we start talking about that. So that's it for how did Europe control Latin America, and I'll see you in class.